Okay, if I were to ask you to make a completely original decision right now, one that wasn't influenced by your parents or your friends or your phone or even your education, you couldn't do it. In fact, it would be impossible for you to do it. Not because you're not smart, you are, but because every decision you've ever had to make leading up to this point has been influenced by the information you intentionally and unintentionally absorb. What you wear, who you trust, what you believe in, even the goals that you set for yourself, where did they come from? Because they didn't start with you. It started with what you were taught and what you've experienced and what you've consumed. I want you to think about this question today. If everything you know shapes everything you do, what happens when what you know is incomplete? Or worse, controlled? Because the knowledge that you have and the knowledge that you don't have quietly determines the life you're able to live. History proves this point to us. In the 1400s, something was invented that completely changed how the world would work forever, and that was the Gutenberg printing press. Before the press, information was extremely limited. People didn't read not because they weren't capable, but because they didn't have to. Why would you read a book if someone could read it and tell you what it was about? Along with that, books were rare and expensive and often written in Latin, which meant the only people that could read those books were the elites or scholars or religious leaders. Actually, historians estimate that at the time of the press, there were only about 30,000 books in all of Europe, and that's limited information in itself. So for the average person, knowledge didn't exist. It was completely controlled. So where do they turn to for their source of truth? They started to turn to the religious leaders. They were the ones who were reading the books and teaching the doctrine and teaching you what to believe. But just beyond belief, they were teaching you how to think and how to understand. And they taught those people not to question or analyze. And they taught them that they didn't need to know. So you can imagine that at the time of the press, they felt pretty threatened because they believed that when knowledge becomes accessible, control becomes harder to maintain. And if people could read for themselves and write for themselves and think for themselves, they would start to challenge things that had never been challenged before. And it would threaten these leaders' control or idea of control. But that's exactly what happened. Because in just 50 years, those 30,000 books turned into 20 million. So you can imagine the ideas that were being spread. People were moving fast. They were talking, they were questioning, they were analyzing. They were doing all the things they were taught not to do. And they discovered that truth wasn't something you were told, but it was something you could discover. And that changed history because it taught people that control wasn't the power, it was the knowledge itself. What I find interesting about this is it's not just historical, it's also spiritual. Because before the press and before the idea that knowledge is power, God had been teaching us that knowledge matters. In D&C 93:36, we read that the glory of God is intelligence, or in other words, light and truth. Now, this is a great scripture that you may have read and moved on from, maybe highlighted, but I want to think about it a little bit longer in the context of knowledge. Because the glory of God, the thing that literally defines Him, is light and truth. So when we are actively seeking that light and truth, we're becoming more like Him. And if that's true, then knowledge isn't just useful, it's divine. And it's a Christ-like attribute that we can all work towards. Another scripture that goes along with this is 2 Nephi 2:26, where we learn that we are free to act for ourselves. We're given the gift of agency, which is one of the greatest gifts you'll ever be given. And knowledge doesn't just give us power, it gives us freedom. So the more knowledge we gain, the more freedom we have. And when we exercise our agency to find truth in a world where truth is hard to find, we have more freedom. I didn't always believe this. Growing up, I was dyslexic, which meant that when I read, words were jumbled all over the page, and things didn't make sense to me like other kids. So in first grade, I remember that I was sent across the hall to a different class completely. And while my friends did their reading time, I was stuck in a different class with kids I didn't know from different grades. It made me upset. And when we would finish our smaller reading time, they would make us play chess. And every day for a year, I played chess. And I got really good. But I was frustrated. I thought, why are they not letting me gain this knowledge that my other friends and students are? But I realized it wasn't about that. I wasn't lacking knowledge. I was gaining it in a different area. And it taught me something powerful. It taught me about confidence in our own understanding, and confidence in seeking truth, and confidence in gaining knowledge in different areas that we wouldn't have thought of before. Because I wasn't lacking knowledge, it was just different from my friends. And it taught me that one thing we all have in common is that knowledge will shape us. Forget that slide for just a moment. We are the most informed generation that there has ever been. We have access to podcasts and YouTube videos and dictionaries, even languages, all in our back pocket. But what good is that if we're not using those tools and using that information? Because access to information doesn't immediately mean knowledge. And this brings me to intentionality. Because when we're not intentional about what we learn, we don't actually control our thinking, and something else does. Now, what else could be controlling our thinking? It's our algorithms. If I were to take one of your guys' phones and start scrolling, I guarantee that it would be completely different from the person sitting next to you. And that's because we've curated this feed for us. So we may be thinking, I'm on my phone a lot. I see a lot of things. I'm seeing it all. But you're really only getting a small portion that your phone's created for you. So is this access to information, or is it limiting our information? We also may find ourselves stuck in this loop, because as college students, our sole purpose is to be educated. We come to school to be taught. But are we coming to school to complete the assignments, meet the deadlines, check the boxes? Are we coming to get that grade? If you're coming to this class today to get an A, you're here for the wrong reason. Because as college students, we're not here to be taught at. We're here to learn to learn. I think it's really important to remember, and if we're seeking that truth and learning to learn, we're going to get out of this cycle. If you want to stay in this cycle, that's great. I have a great tool for you, and it's called ChatGPT. And it will complete your assignments, but it also limits your understanding. Because the goal isn't to produce answers, it's to build understanding. And when we're using those tools, they might be great. They're going to get us an A, but we're not going to get the material, and we're not going to gain that knowledge for ourselves. And when you lack understanding, you lack knowledge. And when you lack knowledge, you lack power. Today we've talked about a lot of things. We learned from the Gutenberg Press that knowledge is something you're not told. It's something that you can discover. From the scriptures, we learn that knowledge is divine and that it gives us freedom. From personal experiences, we can learn to get confidence and understand that we're all going to be shaped by knowledge, just in different ways. This week, I invite you to pay attention to the information you're absorbing. What are your friends saying? What are your parents saying? And what is your feed telling you? Because all of that information is going to shape you and your decisions. Because when knowledge spreads, power shifts. And when we're intentional and seek truth, our lives change. Thank you.